All right, hi. This is a optional extra video for anyone who's been talking with me in class about the ideal structure for an English lesson and wants to interrogate that further with me. I used Copilot, which is our Microsoft AI tool here at QUT, to have a conversation because I don't have someone here to role play and do Socratic method. So I used this and I want to show you the results. I'm not going to read out everything it generated, but this is a recording, so if you actually want to read it, you can pause it and see what the machine said. So I started with this question. Can you give advice in role as an English teaching expert and lecturer in education? What would you say is an ideal structure for a school lesson in English? Right? Because I've given you the Lindsay Williams chapter that talks about the excellence in teaching model, and I've showed you explicit teaching structures. But I also keep saying to you, but you don't have to use those because there's no such thing as an ideal English teaching lesson. So I wanted to go in here. Now, it straight away spat me out what I knew it would, which is an explicit teaching lesson. Look at this: learning intentions and success criteria, then activate prior knowledge, then do some explicit instruction and modeling, then do some guided practice, independent application, reflection and feedback, and set some homework or whatever you want to do at the end. This is optional, right? And I saw this generated and I was like, typical. So I said, can you tell me how this differs from a typical lesson structure in other subject areas? Or would you say this lesson structure is the best for all subjects, right? Because when I look at this, there's nothing Englishy about it. To me, this is just the explicit teaching model, which I know English teachers go sick for. It says, great question. Of course, there are other models that other subjects use. So it talked about how it said it gave me this model because English is often text-centered. As I said, you can pause these and read them all later yourself. That was pretty interesting. It said it gave me this model because English has to have a lot of open-ended discussions and critical thinking, and this lets that happen. It says it needs creative and analytical balance. And I didn't buy that because explicit teaching only lets us do this one. It's not as good as this one, so whatever. And it says, look, at English works towards these assessment types, which this lesson structure supports. And again, I say, really? It does, but so do others. So gives me this. Now, I often am talking with those of you who are in the arts, or sometimes people who do inquiry learning, about your lesson structures, because people in the arts get a different lesson structure that's more workshop based, right? You do some immersion at the start and then you set people off learning their own thing. So I asked it, when you say that the arts is heavily creative and so it can't use explicit teaching so much, which is I know what you get told too. Don't use explicit teaching in the arts. You get told this all the time. I've asked it, should it be the case that English lessons should look more arts-based when the thing that we're doing is creative? Like if I'm doing something highly creative in English, should it look more arts-based? And it goes, about how sometimes a lesson does have to focus on process and sometimes a lesson does have to have more student-centered learning. And so it's giving me ideas for what I could steal and use in English for more creative leaning lessons. Maybe using a workshop model, which I did show you in a lesson planning video. Like I showed you a workshop model in the lesson planning video. So go back and look at that if you're curious. And emphasizing craft and technique. And it's got this lovely table about how the lesson structure might shift. Pause that if you're interested. Little things like engagement in a traditional English lesson might be very text-based, but in a creative English lesson might be more sensory or imaginative. Isn't that interesting? So here, if you're thinking for your assignment, you want to talk about this, but how do you cite this weird extra lecture, the mini video I've given you? If you're arts-based, you can cite your readings from over in your other teaching area. Same for history or anything that's inquiry-based. If you want to do something more inquiry-based, you can use the sources from your other teaching area and come and tell me why you want to make a bit of a blend. See, I've invited it here to blend the arts-based stuff. So here I said, can you suggest some sources for your typical, because I hate, it's now using the word typical or traditional, and as an English teacher, I get, finicky about words, but can you suggest some sources, or is this a structure that you created with no particular source to cite? And it went, what I've got in mind is this advice from the New South Wales Department, this advice from the Victorian Department. It reckons that the curriculum itself, even though it doesn't prescribe a lesson plan structure, supports its model. And you'll see in a minute, I'm going to prompt it to go further because I call bullshit on that. And it gives me a South Australia. So it's like, I didn't pull it from nowhere. Here's where I pulled it. I'm like, okay, fair enough. I said, yes, I would like a version of this because it offers sometimes, would you like a version of this mapped to the curriculum? And I thought, what could that possibly look like? So I said yes, because I was curious. And it gave me a lesson plan, just like before, but telling me how each phase might align to my English content. I'll scroll over that in case you want to pause and read it. It satisfied my curiosity. I didn't want to delve into this further. I didn't think it made heaps of sense in terms of how I would use a curriculum, but that's fine. The reason it did it was because it found a quote that said teaching and learning programs should balance all three strands, which is true, but that doesn't mean every lesson has to balance all three strands, but a whole program should. Okay. I said, yeah, I want to return to something you said earlier about how the Australian curriculum doesn't prescribe a lesson plan structure, but it supports a typical one. And I said, can you tell me more about what source supports your view? And it thought the curriculum did. I'll scroll over this. You can pause it. I thought some of this reasoning was a bit of a stretch, to be honest, but I could see some of its points. I could see how some of you might reference some of these quotes to make your points. Wasn't super clear link between that and an explicit teaching model, to be honest. Anyway, that's okay. It does say, look, it should be scaffolded practice and it should have critical and creative engagement and reflective thinking. So explicit teaching sometimes, but it also has to be all these things. I thought that was a fair enough takeaway, right? Nelly at the end of this, I think. I don't want to talk you through this too much more, but I asked it a little bit more about its questions. Where was it getting its information from the curriculum? So again, I'll go over those in case you're curious. But I think what was interesting is when I got to here, and it said something about how surely what the curriculum is asking for cannot be achieved through discovery alone, was its reasoning. And I went, that I buy. That's not bullshit. That is true. The types of learning it describes cannot be achieved by discovery alone. That's true. But I'm curious why your typical English lesson doesn't include even a possibility for discovery. Or, to put it another way, why did you default to giving me an explicit teaching lesson structure rather than advise me that discovery-based lesson plans were also an option? Because this is what I'm worried about for you all, is that you'll open up these AI tools and they're just going to keep giving you the explicit teaching model as the only way to do things, and you'll keep thinking it's the only way to do things. So that's why I asked it this question. It says, I did that because all of these sources say they want it. And I'm like, okay, well, here's the government telling us how to teach, not theory or teachers, but anyway. It gave me some other reasons because it's not as widely recognized or whatever, but it said to me, it's because you asked for an ideal structure. I thought that was really interesting. So my closing point for you here is what I asked it, and this is what you can do too. So this is your AI literacy moment, I think, is how could I have improved my prompt to get an answer next time that gives me a fuller breadth? So if you've made it this far in the video and you are inclined to use AI, here's my takeaway for you, is be careful of asking it for a single answer. sent me down this view. Orthodoxical approaches is what it gives you. Instead, it suggests using things like range or variety, right? Can you outline a range of effective lesson structures? And you can also ask it specifically to please include conventional and alternative approaches. I'll definitely do something like that next time. If I'm secretly asking and hoping for an arts-based template, then I should have asked it that. I could say, please go beyond explicit instruction and include discovery based. If that's what I want, ask it that, and don't ask it for something like ideal. Tell it more specifically what I want, and it would give me more of those. And because I was annoyed that it was just going to state governments and policy and curriculum, it says, well, if you wanted something based on scholarship, then you could have asked me to base this on scholarship. And it says, then I would have told you about Rosenblatt and reader response, which would have been awesome. It's like, and then I would have referred to Freire and critical pedagogy, which would have been awesome. Britton and Barnes, oh my gosh, language across the curriculum. You all know Vygotsky, but those other three are English and literacy specific, really cool stuff. So there are some tips for you. There is what I found. I'll go through here in case you're really invested, because it compared some different approaches for me, constructivist and critical workshop models, which I highly advocate in English. They work really well. Task-based learning. Gave me a little summary table. Oh, how useful is that? How useful is that? So pause as you need, right? The last thing I picked on it is it said that explicit teaching was just mainstream, and I called it out. I'm like, it's behaviorism, mate. It's behaviorism that sits under that model, wouldn't you say? And it said, yes, that is fair and accurate. So explicit teaching, friends, to make that theoretical link for you, is based on behaviorism as an approach, with a little dose of cognitivism as well. So behaviorism and a bit of social cognitivism. And I said, yep, give me a comparison chart, why not, of learning theories and English. So here we have lesson structure, learning theory, principles and practices. So behaviorism and cognitivism underneath explicit teaching. So those of you who weren't into Pavlov's dog and Skinner and treating kids like puppies, it might be why you don't like this so much, but it works sometimes. Inquiry is constructivism. Critical pedagogy, you're pulling from critical theory. Workshop is also constructivism, but with some humanism. And I think task-based and our project-based is got some sociocultural theory in there as well. Okay, that's the end of my walkthrough, and hope any of you found that useful. If not, I did anyway, so thanks for the talk through.